Part 1. A People Born into Suffering. The Necron Tire. Close your eyes and imagine the worst star in the galaxy. Not a distant, gentle sun that warms a blue-green world, but something angry and volatile, pouring radiation into the void, the way a wound pours blood. Something that punishes every living thing beneath it, simply for the crime of being alive. Now imagine that this star is the only home you have ever known. That your entire civilization, every monument you ever raised, every song your people ever sang, every child ever born to your species, came into the world under the unblinking, poisoned eye of that merciless light. That is the world the Necrontyr came from. And it explains almost everything about who they were and what they eventually became. Long before the 41st millennium, long before the Emperor walked on Terra, or the first Space Marine ever drew breath, before the Eldari Empire rose to its luminous heights and burned itself hollow with excess, there existed a species, flesh and blood, mortal, cursed from the very first heartbeat. The Necrontyr, as they called themselves, were born on a world drenched in ionizing radiation from a star so volatile that no amount of shelter, no engineered building material, no medical intervention could fully protect them. The radiation reached them regardless. It seeped through their wools, worked its way into their cells, and rewrote the biological instructions that held their bodies together. The result was a civilization of people who were perpetually, terminally ill. Cancer was not an occasional tragedy for the Necrontyr, it was a certainty. Every person born into their society carried it as a kind of birthright, a death sentence handed down from the stars at the moment of conception. Their lifespans were short in a way that defies simple explanation. We might describe it in years, but the reality is better understood as a cultural condition. The Necrontyr did not simply die young. They built their entire civilization around dying young. They internalized it, philosophized it, let it seep into the architecture of their cities and the structure of their social hierarchies until the anticipation of death was not something kept apart from daily life, but woven through it at every level. Their cities are perhaps the most revealing testimony to what they truly were. The vast monuments, the towering structures that dominated their skylines, were not palaces or centers of trade or civic pride. They were tombs, vast, meticulously engineered mausoleums for the ancestors who had gone before. The living quarters were modest in comparison, almost deliberately impermanent, as if the Necrontyr understood on some collective psychological level that their time above ground was the temporary phase, and the tomb was the permanent reality. The dead were honored above the living because the dead were the majority. They were also the destination. Think about what that means for a civilization's psychology over thousands of generations. Every Necrontyr child grew up understanding that their life had an expiration date that was not metaphorical or distant, but immediate and probably visible in the physical deterioration of their parents and grandparents. Every relationship was built on the foundational assumption that it would end in loss before either party was ready. Every achievement, every great work of art or architecture or science was undertaken with the knowledge that the person undertaking it would not live to see its completion in most cases, and certainly would not be there to see what happened to it across the centuries that followed. Death was not an interruption of Necrontyr life. It was the rhythm of it. This produced a peculiar combination of qualities that you see reflected in everything the Necrontyr became. On one hand, a reckless ambition, the kind that comes from knowing you have very little time, a willingness to attempt things that more comfortable species might have considered too dangerous or too uncertain, because the alternative was to do nothing and die anyway. On the other hand, a deep preoccupation with legacy, with leaving something that would persist after the brief flash of individual existence had guttered out. Their greatest achievements were always framed in terms of what they would mean after the achiever was gone, what their descendants would inherit, what their name would mean in the tombs that recorded it. Their religious traditions were organized entirely around the dead, which again makes intuitive sense for a people whose dead outnumbered their living in any given generation. The ancestors were not simply remembered. They were consulted, communicated with through complex burial rituals and interpretive practices that may or may not have had any genuine metaphysical basis, but served the deeply practical purpose of giving the living a way to feel connected to the vast majority of their population that existed in the form of bones and ash. The tombs were not just memorials, they were the city's real centers of social life, the places where the most important decisions were made and the most significant ceremonies conducted. This is not to say they were a broken people. There is something remarkable in what the Necrontyr achieved, in spite of everything their star tried to do to them. They were brilliant. They had to be. Developing a civilization under those conditions requires a particular kind of ingenuity, a necessity-driven creativity that pushes minds to solve problems that easier species never encounter. They mastered materials science early, developing necrodermis, the living metal that would eventually become the substance of their transformed bodies. They built starships, first slow antimatter-powered torch ships clad in necrodermis to resist the long journeys through the void, then faster and more capable vessels as the generations compounded their knowledge. They built an interstellar empire. Dynasty by dynasty, world by world, they pushed outward from their miserable home star into the galaxy, carrying their culture of grief and their extraordinary technical minds with them. Each dynasty was its own power, governed by a ruling pharaoh, and above all the dynasties stood the Triarch, a ruling council of 3 of the most powerful pharaohs. At the head of the Triarch sat the Silent King, the supreme ruler of all Necrontyr civilization. The title was a deliberately symbolic one. The Silent King did not speak directly to his subjects. He spoke only through the 2 other pharaohs who sat on the Triarch beside him. His voice filtered through ceremony and protocol. His authority made all the more imposing for the mystery that surrounded his direct words. The title of Silent King was hereditary in theory, but in practice it passed between dynasties. Because the Necrontyr lifespans were so uncertain, so prone to sudden violent truncation by their own bodies, that no single bloodline could hold it for long. Their civilizational structures were built to accommodate a constant turnover of leadership, a perpetual reshuffling of power in the wake of death, which itself tells you a great deal about how deeply mortality had shaped every aspect of how they organized themselves. The Sarikhan dynasty eventually came to hold the title of Silent King, and it was a Sarikhan who would be the last to bear it, a figure named Sarek. This is not a name history whispers quietly. It is one of the most consequential names in the entire history of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, a name attached to decisions so sweeping in their consequences that their ripple effects are still being felt 60 million years after they were made. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. The Necrontyr Empire expanded, but expansion did not bring unity. As it grew, the natural pressures that come with geographic and cultural distance began to fray the bonds that held the dynasties together. Individual realms grew powerful enough to question the authority of the Triarch. Ancient grudges that had been manageable when everyone lived in close proximity became insurmountable when separated by interstellar distances. What began as political tension hardened into open conflict. The first wars of secession, as they came to be called, were a series of internal conflicts in which entire Necrontyr dynasties broke away from the Triarch, fighting for independence from the central authority that had always held the empire together. These wars were corrosive in a way that went beyond the military casualties. They represented a fundamental fracturing of Necrontyr identity, the collapse of the idea that they were one people bound by shared suffering and shared purpose. The Triarch knew that if the internal divisions continued unchecked, there would be nothing left of the empire worth saving. Unity would need to come from somewhere outside the conflicts that were tearing them apart. It would need an external force, an enemy so overwhelming, so undeniable, that the petty grievances between dynasties would shrink to irrelevance in the face of it. The Triarch began to look for such an enemy, and that search would eventually lead them to a fateful encounter, one that would set the Necrontyr on a path from which there was never any return. But before they found their war, they found something else first. Something that deepened their resentment, their bitterness, their aching, all-consuming jealousy. They found the Old Ones, and the Old Ones had something the Necrontyr had been dying for since the first of them drew breath. The Old Ones were immortal. That word, immortal, sits at the center of everything the Necrontyr ever did. It is the gravity around which their entire civilization orbited, the wound that never closed, the hunger that nothing in the material universe could satisfy. Here was a species that had existed since the galaxy was young, that moved through the cosmos with a casual, breathtaking confidence that comes only from knowing that death is not a guest that will ever visit your door. They were cold-blooded and reptilian in appearance, old beyond any meaningful reckoning, and connected in ways the Necron could barely comprehend to the strange and powerful dimension of the warp, which in those ancient times was not the screaming nightmare it would later become, but a calm, tranquil reflection of the material world's living minds. The Old Ones did not merely live long, they were the architects of life itself, seeding worlds across the galaxy with carefully engineered species, fostering civilizations, tending to the development of sentient life, the way a gardener tends to a garden. They traveled through the webway, a network of extra-dimensional tunnels they had constructed that allowed them to cross the galaxy instantaneously without touching the warp directly. It was a feat of engineering and knowledge so advanced that it appeared to lesser minds as something close to magic. They were, in every measurable sense, the closest thing to gods that the material universe had yet produced. The Necron approached them with a request that must have seemed, to the Old Ones, almost pathetically simple in its desperation. They wanted to live, not forever, perhaps. They did not demand immortality on the first asking. They asked for the knowledge, the biological secret, that would let them live as the Old Ones did. They wanted to know what kept the Old Ones young, while every Necron child was born, already carrying the seeds of its own destruction. The Old Ones refused. There is no single explanation preserved in the surviving records for why they said no. Perhaps they considered the Necron too young, too immature in their civilization, too prone to violence and internal conflict to be trusted with extended life. Perhaps they genuinely believed that mortality was a necessary condition for growth, that the pressure of a finite existence produced the kind of urgency and creativity that immortal beings, comfortable in their endless ages, could never know. Perhaps they simply did not care enough to help. Whatever the reason, the answer was no, and that answer fell on the Necron like a sentence of death, because in every meaningful way, it was exactly that. The bitterness that followed was not merely political or strategic, it was existential. The Necron had been told, by the most powerful beings they had ever encountered, that they did not deserve the one thing their entire culture had been organized around wanting. They had been denied the cure for the wound that defined them. And if the Old Ones would not share their secrets willingly, then the Necron would find another way. Any way. The Triarchs saw their opportunity. Here was the external enemy the internal conflicts had been waiting for. The Necron might hate each other, but they hated the Old Ones more. They hated them with the pure, clean, uncomplicated fury of people who have been told their pain does not matter. The wars of secession did not end overnight, but they weakened. Separatist dynasties that had been fighting the Triarch found common cause in a new conflict. The Silent King offered amnesty to any dynasty that returned to the fold. Most of them accepted, not out of forgiveness or reconciliation, but because there was now a greater enemy to focus that boundless rage upon. The war in heaven had begun, and the Necron marched to it with 60 million years of grief and resentment driving their steps. If you are enjoying this story so far, the greatest thing you can do is drop a comment below, let me know what you think, and if you have not subscribed yet, now is the perfect time. There is a lot more to cover, and it only gets stranger and darker from here. Part 2. The Old Ones and the First War. Courage without hope. The first phase of what would eventually be called the War in Heaven was, by any honest account, a disaster for the Necron. This should not come as a surprise when you consider the gap between the two sides. The Necron were genuinely remarkable by the standards of the mortal species they had encountered. Brilliant engineers with powerful starships and a deep understanding of materials science and energy weapons. But they were mortal. They operated on timescales defined by the lifespan of their soldiers. Their generals could live perhaps 40 or 50 years before the radiation took them. Their logistical chains were built around biological vulnerabilities. Their ships were impressive but crossed space at sublight speeds on long journeys that required stasis crypts to keep the crews alive. Against an enemy that could deploy forces across the galaxy in moments through the webway, that possessed psychic abilities of staggering magnitude, and that had been perfecting the art of civilization for millions of years, the Necron were simply outmatched in ways that no amount of courage or technical ingenuity could bridge. The old ones fought without apparent urgency. This is perhaps the most psychologically devastating detail of the early war, because it communicated something the Necron tier could feel even through the distance of interstellar combat. The old ones did not hurry. They did not mobilize with the desperate energy of a species fighting for survival. They fought the Necron tier the way a mountain weathers a storm, with patient, unhurried certainty that the threat would pass. That time, which was the old one's greatest ally and the Necron tier's greatest enemy, would do most of the work. They used the webway to appear precisely where they were needed and vanish before the Necron tier could coordinate a response. Their psychic abilities, channeling the calm energies of the ancient warp, could unmake Necron tier formations from a distance that no physical weapon could reach. Battle after battle, the Necron tier were pushed back. Systems they had claimed fell again. Colonies were lost. The casualties were catastrophic. And as the losses mounted, the old fractures within Necron tier society threatened to reopen, because nothing erodes unity faster than losing. The second wars of secession were beginning to simmer beneath the surface of the war effort, dynasties whispering among themselves that the Triarch had led them into a fight they could not win, that the cost in lives and resources was too high for a war that seemed to have no end and no path to victory. The Necron tier had pushed the old ones. There is no question of that. They had forced their ancient enemy to take them seriously, to commit real forces and real effort to the conflict in ways the old ones had never had to do before. But taking them seriously was not the same as being threatened by them. The old ones' grip on the galaxy remained firm, their webway intact, their allied species and the worlds they had cultivated still beyond the Necron tier's reach. In a few short centuries, the Necron tier found themselves exactly where they had always feared they would end up, isolated, diminished, and pushed to the edges of the galaxy, clinging to existence in the outer dark near the halo stars. The failure of the First War was a wound that sat alongside all the other wounds the Necron tier had ever carried, alongside the radiation that stole their years and the old ones that kept their secret and the endless death that was simply the weather of their existence. There is something almost unbearable about imagining it, the Necron tier in those years of retreat and bitterness, their civilization intact enough to continue, but hollowed out by the knowledge that they had tried their greatest effort and found it insufficient. They prayed for something. They searched for something, some power, some weapon, some ally that could change the mathematics of a war they were losing. And in the dark spaces near dying stars, they found the answer to those prayers. Though whether what they found was truly an answer, or simply a new and more elegant form of the doom they had always been carrying, is perhaps the most important question in the entire history of the Necron race. What they found was the chitin, and nothing was ever the same again. Part 3. The Star Gods, Ancient Hunger Given Form. The chitin are one of those concepts in Warhammer 40,000 lore that rewards sitting with for a while, letting the full weight of what they are sink in before moving on. Because the chitin are not simply powerful aliens or dangerous entities or cosmic threats in the conventional sense. They are something much stranger, much older, and much more fundamental to the nature of the universe than that description captures. The chitin, according to the lore, came into existence at the very beginning of the universe. When the first stars ignited out of the primal darkness, when those vast nuclear furnaces blazed to life and began pouring energy into a cosmos that had been cold and empty, some of that energy became sentient. Not immediately, and not in a way that the word sentient fully conveys. The chitin were more like slow-forming weather patterns of pure energy, vast and diffuse, feeding on the electromagnetic output of the stars themselves, developing something like awareness over unimaginable stretches of time. In their original form, the chitin were barely conscious in any meaningful way. They drifted near the hearts of stars, sipping at energies that were to them what sunlight is to a plant, sustaining but not particularly rich. They had no bodies in any material sense. They were processes more than beings, currents in the energy fields of space, immensely ancient and almost preternaturally patient. The Necron tier, when they first detected them near their own blighted star, initially saw them as natural phenomena, as atmospheric effects or exotic stellar radiation that their instruments were struggling to categorize. The realization that these things were sentient, that they responded to observation, that something like attention flickered in them when they were studied, came gradually, And once that realization landed, the Necron-tier minds immediately began to race toward implications, because a sentient being of pure energy was exactly the kind of thing that could be weaponized. Not out of malice, at least not initially, out of desperate pragmatism. The Necron-tier had a war they were losing, and they had just potentially discovered a category of entity that the old ones might not be able to easily counter. The Necron-tier gave these entities their name, chitin, meaning star gods in the ancient tongue of the Necron-tier people. And then, with the peculiar ingenuity that characterized everything the Necron-tier had ever built, they did something extraordinary. They created bodies for them. Using their mastery of necrodermis, the living metal that had shielded their ships and their cities for generations, they developed a method for focusing the diffuse energy of a chitin into a single concentrated shell of living metal, a physical form, a vessel. The effect on the chitin was transformative in ways the Necron-tier had not fully anticipated. A chitin, given a necrodermis body, was no longer a slow, drifting cloud of energy processing stellar radiation at the pace of geological change. It became something focused and aware in a way it had never been before. The body sharpened its consciousness, concentrated its power, gave it hands with which to reach into the material world and reshape it. For the first time, the chitin could think in real time, act with something like intention, communicate clearly, and above all, feed on something far more interesting than starlight. The first chitin to be given a body was Azagorod, who would become known in the dread chronicles of every civilization that survived those ancient wars as the Nightbringer. And the Nightbringer made its nature known immediately, in the most horrifying way possible. The Necron-tier workers who had built its body, who had guided it through the process and stood nearby to observe the result of their extraordinary labor, were consumed. The Nightbringer tasted mortal life force for the first time, and discovered something the stellar energies it had fed on for billions of years had never offered. Depth, richness, a quality of experience utterly unlike anything else. The life energies of living beings tasted, to a chitin, like the difference between drinking flat, tepid water and tasting something warm and complex and impossibly satisfying. The Necron-tier convinced it not to consume them all, only through pledges of loyalty and service, essentially making themselves the Nightbringer's worshippers in exchange for their survival. This should have been the moment they reconsidered everything. This should have been the warning loud enough to make the entire project stop. They had just built a body for something that immediately ate the people who built it, and they responded by promising it more. But they were desperate, and desperation is a quality that consistently causes intelligent beings to continue down roads that terrified minds would otherwise abandon. Other chitin were given bodies. Each one was its own kind of catastrophe waiting to unfold. The one known to history as Mephetron, who took the name the Deceiver, because in the ancient Necron-tier mythology, the chitin were connected to forgotten gods, and the Deceiver chose the role of the trickster and the manipulator, the one who tells you exactly what you need to hear in exactly the way that serves his purposes. The entity known as Magladroth, the Void Dragon, considered by many the most powerful of all the Khitan, a being whose mastery over the material realm and physical technology was so absolute that it would, millions of years later, become the object of worship for the Adeptus Mechanicus of the Imperium of Man, misidentified as their divine machine god, and believed to sleep beneath the surface of Mars itself. The Void Dragon was the supreme military asset of the chitin arsenal. Its warriors during the war in heaven were essentially invincible, able to channel devastating energy attacks and armored against nearly everything the old ones could throw at them. Even among the chitin, the Void Dragon inspired a kind of wariness. The Deceiver, who was genuinely unafraid of most things and had made a career of manipulating beings more powerful than itself, avoided the Void Dragon. That alone should tell you something. And then there was Azagorod the Nightbringer, whose legacy stretches beyond any single war or civilization. The Nightbringer fed and fed and fed during the conflict that followed, and as it consumed the life force of mortal beings on a scale that staggered even the other chitin, it did something terrible to the psychic fabric of the galaxy. It reached into the minds of every sentient species it encountered and planted something deep in their collective unconscious, a fear. Not just the ordinary fear of injury or pain, but the specific, primal, existential terror of death itself. the gut-deep horror of non-existence. The Nightbringer burned the fear of dying into the psychological bedrock of every mortal species, and this is why, according to the lore, virtually every civilization in the 41st millennium, human and alien alike, fears death in that particular visceral way. It is not simply a rational response to mortality. It is the psychic scar left by a star god that fed on that fear billions of years ago. The Deceiver was the Satan most directly involved in what happened next, because it was the Deceiver who approached Zarek, the Silent King, with the offer that would reshape the galaxy. The Deceiver came to him with a story, and whether any part of that story was true is still debated in the surviving records. It claimed that the Satan had also once fought and lost a war against the Old Ones. It claimed that the Satan and the Necron Tyre shared an enemy. It promised two things: victory in the war in heaven, and immortality. Zarek wanted to believe it. His people were dying in a war they had started out of desperation, fracturing from internal conflict, sustained only by the shared hatred of an enemy they could not defeat on their own. Here was a being of extraordinary power, offering exactly what the Necrontyr had always wanted most. Of course he wanted to believe it, and whatever warnings his advisors raised, whatever doubts his own mind generated about whether an entity that consumed its creators could genuinely be trusted as an ally, Zarek ultimately accepted the offer. He was not the only one who would come to regret what happened next, but he was the one who carried the weight of it longest. Part 4. Biotransference, the death of a soul. The process the Satan proposed was called biotransference. It is, in the history of every sentient species that has ever existed in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, the single most consequential transaction ever made. Not the Horus Heresy, not the fall of the Aeldari, not the birth of Slaanesh or the sealing of the Golden Throne. This moment, when the Necrontyr agreed to change what they were in exchange for what they had always wanted, this is the hinge point of everything. On its face, the logic was elegant. The Necrontyr were creatures of flesh, and their flesh was their enemy. It betrayed them. It decayed. It failed them under radiation that never stopped and never softened, producing cancers that consumed them from within, shortening their lives to fragments of what the Old Ones enjoyed, simply as a baseline. The solution, as the Satan presented it, was to replace the flesh, not to modify it or to shore up its defenses with medicine or engineering, but to abandon it entirely. To transfer the consciousness of each Necron Tyre into a body of living metal, of necrodermis, immune to radiation and cancer and disease and the slow erosion of time, invulnerable in ways that no organic shell could ever be. Essentially, in the most technical sense of the word, immortal. The Necrontyr had been building tombs for their dead for as long as they had existed as a civilization. The irony of what biotransference turned them into did not announce itself immediately. It came later, slowly, in the terrible clarity that follows a decision you cannot unmake. The process took place in vast industrial installations called the Soul Forges. These were not quiet, peaceful places of transformation. They were enormous, terrifying machines that processed the Necrontyr population at industrial scale, drawing the consciousness of each individual free from their biological brain and imprinting it into the memory lattices of a newly constructed necrodermis body. Millions entered the Soul Forges, millions emerged on the other side, and the Satan fed on what poured out in between. Because the Soul Forges did not simply transfer consciousness, they harvested the soul, the electromagnetic life energy of the Necrontyr, the ineffable quality that made them more than simply biological machines running biological programs, that gave them the capacity for love and grief and resentment and joy, and all the other things that made them a civilization rather than simply an organism, was torn free in the process of transfer. The Satan consumed it. Billions upon billions of Necrontyr souls, feeding the star gods in a feast of life energy that made their earlier feasting on mortal flesh look modest by comparison. The necrodermis bodies that stepped away from the Soul Forges were functional. They moved. They processed information. They retained the memories of the beings whose minds they now housed. They could fight and think and follow orders, and even, in the higher castes, maintain something of their individual personalities and the social hierarchies they had built. But the soul was gone. The part of them that had connected to something deeper than the material world, that had the capacity to feel in the way that living beings feel, that made existence meaningful rather than simply operational, that was consumed. The ruling elite of Necrontier civilization, the noble pharaons and their court, emerged from biotransference with something closer to their original minds intact. Their new bodies were more sophisticated, built to preserve the complexity of their personalities to a degree that was simply not applied to the common soldiers and workers who made up the bulk of the Necrontyre population. This was not generosity, it was utility. The Citan needed commanders who could think independently, who could lead their new metal legions with genuine strategic intelligence rather than simply following programmed instructions. The noble caste retained enough of themselves to serve that purpose. The rest were reduced to something much closer to automatons, driven by the command protocols embedded in their new forms, capable of executing orders with mechanical precision but stripped of the inner life that had once made them people rather than machinery. Sarek came through the process with his full mind intact. He had been given, by the Citan, the most sophisticated and powerful Necron body of any being in the new metal civilization, one with a sensory and neurological network so advanced that it far surpassed what his organic form had possessed. He could think more clearly than before. He could process more information, model more scenarios, see more angles of every situation than his biological brain had ever managed. He was, in purely functional terms, more capable than he had ever been, and it was this enhanced clarity of thought that allowed him to understand, with immediate and devastating precision, exactly what had been done. When Zarek saw what had been done, in the words preserved in the ancient records, he knew at last the true nature of the Citan and of the doom they had wrought in his name. His people were immortal now, yes, technically. The necrodermis bodies would not decay, would not develop cancer, would not be taken by the radiation of their ancient star, but they were also empty in a way that mocked the immortality they had been promised. They were the living dead, carrying memories of who they had been, without the soul that had made those memories matter. The flesh they had despaired of was gone, but so was everything that had ever made the flesh worth inhabiting. They had traded their deaths for something worse. They had traded the possibility of meaning for the certainty of duration. Consider what that means in practice. A Necron warrior who steps out of a soul forge still has the memories of being a Necrontyre soldier. They remember their name. They remember their family. They remember the world they grew up in, the people they loved, the things that mattered to them before they walked into the forge. But the connection between the memory and anything resembling emotional response is simply absent. They remember loving their family the way you might remember reading a passage in a book. The information is there. The significance is not. They remember the faces but not the warmth. They carry the history of a life that they can no longer feel. For the common warriors and workers, this disconnect was total. The command protocols replaced the will that had been removed. They moved because they were directed to move. They fought because they were programmed to fight. They were extraordinarily effective, capable of executing complex tactical instructions with mechanical precision, resilient in ways no organic soldier had ever been. But they were not people in any meaningful sense. They were the most sophisticated weapons the galaxy had ever produced, wearing the faces of the people the Citan had consumed. The noble castes were different in degree but not in kind. Emotek, the Stormlord, Trazen, the Infinite, Oricon, the Diviner, all the great figures who would eventually define Necron civilization in the 41st millennium, emerged from biotransference with enough of their original personalities preserved to be recognizable as individuals with distinct values and goals. But even they describe, in the moments when the lore grants us access to their inner experience, a sense of removal from their own histories that colors everything they do. Trazen collects. He preserves the past with a devotion that borders on obsession. Is this not the behavior of a being who is acutely aware that his own past, his own personal history as a Necrontyre individual, is something he can only access as data rather than experience? Who builds his existence around other histories because his relationship with his own has been irreparably severed? Oricon calculates the future. He reads the stars and extracts predictions from the mathematical patterns of the cosmos. Is this not the behavior of a being who cannot access the living quality of the present moment, and has redirected all his cognitive energy towards something that feels more tractable, toward the future, which at least he has not lost yet? The Necron experience of time is alien in ways that matter. They do not age. They do not feel the accumulated weight of hours in their bodies, because their bodies do not accumulate anything, only repair and maintain. They do not get tired. They do not get hungry. They do not have the biological rhythms that structure organic experience into something with texture and variation. A Necron's awareness of time passing is purely cognitive, a count of events, rather than a felt experience of duration. And this means that the 60 million years they spent in the Great Sleep was not 60 million years of experience. It was simply an absence, a gap in the record, a period with no data. They went to sleep and they woke up, and the only evidence that anything happened in between is the changed galaxy they find themselves in. This is, if you think about it for long enough, one of the most quietly devastating aspects of the Necron condition. They were promised immortality, and they received it in a form that strips the experience of duration of any qualitative content. Living forever is not the same as experiencing forever, and the Necrons live in a strange borderland between those two things, technically present across the full span of time, but experientially fragmented, their consciousness present only in the active periods and absent in the sleeps, their existence a series of waking intervals rather than a continuous flowing life. Sarek understood this, and he chose, in the moment of understanding, to say nothing, to maintain the command protocols that held his people under his authority and push them forward into the war that the Satan were now directing them toward. He was not unfeeling. Even in a body of living metal, he felt something, some echo of the anguish that would have overwhelmed him if he had let it, and he buried it under the stone-cold calculation that the Necrontyrs' only chance at anything, at any future, at any possible redemption, was to win the war they had started. After that, perhaps, something could be salvaged. He bided his time. He carried his grief like a wound he would not show his enemies, and he waited for the moment when the Citan would be vulnerable. Part 5. The War in Heaven renewed. Death comes to the galaxy. The Necrons who marched out of the Soul Forges and into the renewed war against the Old Ones were something the galaxy had never seen before and would never entirely recover from seeing. They were not alive in the way that any other army had ever been alive. Their weapons did not jam from nerves or the heat of a long march. They did not tire. They did not panic when their comrades fell, because the command protocols that directed them did not include panic as a functional behavior. They did not need food or water or rest. They could operate in the vacuum of space and the crushing pressure of ocean trenches and the killing radiation of stars without modification or equipment. They were, in every practical battlefield sense, perfect soldiers, wearing bodies that could absorb extraordinary damage and continue functioning with the nascent technology of their miraculous self-repair already embedded in the necrodermis itself. Nanoscale systems of canoptech scarabs that worked at the cellular level of their metal forms to seal damage and restore function. And they were led by Citan. The Citan in their bodies of living metal were beyond any scale of power that mortal understanding can comfortably accommodate. They could extinguish stars, not metaphorically or through elaborate weapon systems, but directly, walking up to a sun and consuming it or disrupting its fusion processes on a whim. They could burn entire planets from orbit with the raw energies they wielded. They besieged the fortresses of the Old Ones in ways that the Old Ones, for all their millions of years of preparation, had never needed to prepare for, because nothing in their history had ever threatened them the way the Necrons and their star gods now did. The sheer scale of the war in heaven is something that the 41st millennium's inhabitants can barely conceptualize, even with the evidence of it still visible in the galaxy's astronomical records. Entire star systems were hollowed out. Suns that had burned for billions of years were consumed or destabilized in single engagements. The gravitational structure of whole galactic regions was altered by battles fought at this level. When astronomers in the Imperium observe anomalies in the galaxy's star distribution, when they find regions of inexplicable stellar density or void, when they encounter ancient dead systems whose stars are simply gone, they are looking at the archaeological evidence of a war fought 60 million years ago between beings whose power exceeded anything the current galaxy can easily produce. The war in heaven did not simply affect the peoples involved. It left marks on the physical structure of the Milky Way that persist to this day. The Necrons were central to this destruction, but it is important to be precise about the nature of their role. The common Necron warriors, the metal soldiers who formed the bulk of the armies that swept across the galaxy, were the instruments of the Citan's hunger rather than independent agents of destruction. They did not choose to participate in the red harvests that depopulated hundreds of worlds. They executed the commands of their star god masters because the command protocols embedded in their necrodermis forms directed them to do so, and they had no mechanism for refusal. Only the noble castes retained enough independent cognition to make genuine choices, and the Silent King among them made the choice that the common warriors could not: to wait, to survive, to find the moment when the Citan could be brought down. The Old Ones, for their part, were not simply passive victims. This is sometimes lost in the telling, the way that any sufficiently devastating defeat can retrospectively make the defeated seem helpless. The Old Ones fought with everything they had, and what they had was genuinely formidable. Their creation of the psychic races was not a desperate gamble, but a calculated strategic response that almost worked, that did work long enough to shift the momentum of the war and force the Citan onto the defensive for a significant period. The Eldar they created were not simply soldiers, but something more like living weapons, forged at the level of a species, engineered with psychic capabilities that the Old Ones understood could counter the Titans' material dominance. And the Krork they created were something else entirely, beings of such innate martial ferocity and biological resilience that millions of years of devolution into the orcs of the 41st millennium have still not fully erased those fundamental qualities. The tragedy of the Old Ones is not that they were helpless. It is that their own most potent weapons contributed to their destruction. The psychic species they created to fight the Citan were also the ones who overloaded the warp with the emotional weight of war and gave rise to the enslavers. The very act of channeling the warp's power through mortal minds on a galactic scale destabilized the Immaterium past the point of recovery. The Old Ones built a weapon, and the weapon's discharge destroyed the foundation they were standing on. It is a tragedy of expertise pushed beyond the edge of safe application, a catastrophic success that was also a catastrophic failure simultaneously. The Old Ones are not confirmed dead by any source in the lore. They are confirmed broken, scattered, their civilization destroyed, their webway compromised, their carefully cultivated galaxy devastated. Some theories suggest that remnants of the Old Ones survive in the deepest recesses of the webway, hiding in extra-dimensional spaces so remote and so carefully concealed that even the Eldari, who know the webway better than anyone, have not found them. The Slan of Warhammer fantasy, and their equivalents in 40k lore, have been connected to the Old Ones by some theorists, suggesting that what the Necrons destroyed was the Old Ones' galactic civilization rather than the Old Ones themselves. If any of them survived to observe what the galaxy became in the 60 million years after the war in heaven, and if they are capable of something resembling feeling, then the sight of the Necrons reawakening in the 41st millennium is a development of a significance that only they, among all living beings, could fully appreciate. The Old Ones were not passive. They responded with everything in their extraordinary toolkit. They used the webway to redeploy forces faster than any conventional military technology could match. They brought to bear the psychic arts that were their greatest natural advantage, channeling the energies of the warp, which was still relatively calm in those ancient days, into attacks that could shred reality around Necron formations and disrupt the command protocols that held their armies together. The war burned across the entire galaxy, world after world consumed in fighting, of an intensity that left scars still visible in astronomical records 60 million years later. And the Citan were hungry, unimaginably, terrifyingly hungry. The Old Ones had seeded the galaxy with life, carefully cultivated species on hundreds of worlds, many of them still young and innocent of what was consuming the galaxy around them. The Citan conducted what the surviving records call red harvests, descending on populated worlds with their Necron armies and systematically consuming every living thing, harvesting the life energies of entire civilizations to feed their appetites. They were not even fighting strategically in these harvests. They were simply feeding. Large chunks of the galaxy were reduced to dead, empty systems in the wake of these events, their populations gone, their atmospheres stripped, their stars dimmed or extinguished. As the harvest grew thinner, as more and more of the easily accessible life was consumed, the the Citan began to turn their hunger on each other. This was not entirely accidental. The Deceiver, true to its name, had been at work sowing discord among its fellow star gods for longer than most realized. It convinced the Nightbringer that the life force of other Citan was something worth tasting, that a god that consumed its rivals would grow stronger than it could become any other way. The Nightbringer, being an entity whose primary characteristic was a bottomless appetite and a willingness to indulge it regardless of consequences, was not a difficult target for this kind of manipulation. What followed was a period of Citan cannibalism that reduced their number dramatically. The stronger consumed the weaker. The galaxy-spanning war between the Citan and the Old Ones became entangled with the war among the Citan themselves, a chaotic confluence of conflicts that made the galaxy almost incomprehensible in its violence. The Old Ones, facing an enemy they could not simply outlast, made a desperate decision. They accelerated the creation and development of species specifically engineered to fight the Necrons and their chitin masters. Species with powerful psychic connections to the warp, whose life energies could serve as fuel for psychic warfare in ways that gave the Old Ones a genuine counter to the Citan's material power. Among these species were the Aeldari, engineered to extraordinary psychic capability and eventually nurtured into what would become one of the most significant civilizations the galaxy has ever housed. Among them also were the Krork, a powerful warrior species the Old Ones engineered for martial effectiveness, beings who would eventually devolve and simplify over countless generations into the orcs of the 41st millennium. And others, many others, species whose names are not remembered, whose worlds were consumed before their potential could be realized. The psychic species the Old Ones created worked. The energies of the warp, channeled through beings specifically evolved to access them, were anathema to the Citan in ways that the Old Ones had recognized and weaponized. The Necron advance began to slow. The Citan, who had been essentially invulnerable to conventional weapons, found themselves threatened by attacks that originated in a dimension they could not easily reach into. The war's momentum shifted, and for a period the Old Ones and their newly created warrior races seemed to be genuinely pushing the Necrons and the Citan onto the defensive. This was when the warp itself changed. The violence of the war in heaven was unlike anything the galaxy had ever generated. The scale of destruction, the billions and billions of deaths, the civilizations consumed in red harvests, the psychic screams of species ending simultaneously across hundreds of worlds, all of it poured into the warp, which is a mirror of the material universe's emotional and spiritual life. The warp, which had been calm and cooperative in the days before the war, began to absorb the overwhelming psychic weight of the conflict. Its tranquil depths were disturbed, and then churned, and then fundamentally altered by the sheer volume of suffering pouring into it from the material realm. The psychic races the Old Ones had created made this worse, not through any fault of their own, but simply by existing as the powerful conduits to the warp that they had been designed to be. Their minds poured into the warp even in sleep, even in battle, and their experiences of the war, their terror and grief and rage, were channeled directly into the immaterium at full potency. The warp, saturated beyond any level it had known before, began to generate new phenomena. Entities formed from the accumulated emotional weight of the conflict. Predatory things that had no existence before the war created the conditions for their emergence. Among these entities, the worst were the enslavers. The enslavers were creatures of pure warp origin that could reach into the material universe, possess psychers, use their enslaved hosts as portals to drag more of their kind through into physical reality, and spread through populations with the speed and thoroughness of a catastrophic plague. They were neither the Necrons' allies nor their enemies. They were simply the byproduct of a war fought at a scale that reality itself could not contain without consequence. The Old Ones' webway network, their greatest logistical advantage, began to be compromised by the spreading warp instability. Their centers of power were overrun. Their carefully cultivated young races were increasingly possessed by enslavers. The Old Ones, who had endured for millions of years and had always operated with the confidence of beings who knew they would outlast any threat, found themselves in a situation they had no map for. They were broken. Not in a single decisive battle, but in the way that ancient things break, gradually and then completely. Their networks shattered. Their influence over the young races they had created was severed. They scattered, some fleeing to hidden places in the webway, others seeking refuges so far from the carnage that even the enslavers might not find them. The lore records them as extinct, or as near to extinct as matters, fled so deep into the darkness of the galaxy's mysteries that no record of their survival has ever been confirmed. The greatest civilization the galaxy had ever produced, the architects of life on hundreds of worlds, the masters of the webway and the calm warp, were simply gone. The Necrons and their Citan had won. The galaxy was theirs. And it was a ruin. Part 6. The Revolt Against the Star Gods. A King's Penance. The victory of the Necrons and their Citan over the Old Ones was the greatest military achievement in galactic history. It was also the moment when Sarek, the Silent King, understood that the war's end was finally the opportunity he had been waiting for, since he stepped out of the Soul Forge and realized what had been done to his people. For the duration of the war in heaven, Sarek had maintained the protocols that kept the Necrons under his command, and therefore directed them toward the Citan's objectives. He had needed the war to be won first, not because he accepted the Citan's dominion as legitimate or permanent, but because the Necrons, weakened and divided as they were, could not have survived fighting the Citans and the Old Ones simultaneously. He had waited, with a patience possible only in a being who had been rebuilt from living metal, for the moment when the Citan would be at their most vulnerable and least expecting betrayal. That moment had arrived. The Old Ones were destroyed or scattered. The Aeldari, the greatest of the psychic races the Old Ones had created, were beginning their ascent but had not yet consolidated the power that would eventually make them the dominant civilization of the galaxy. The galaxy was devastated, but emptied of any force that might have served as the Citan's reinforcement or shield. The Citan had consumed each other to the point where only a handful of the original enormous number remained, each one powerful but reduced from what they had been at their peak. Their attention focused on the aftermath of victory and the question of what they would now do with the galaxy they had won. Sarek had spent the final stages of the war watching the Citan carefully, cataloging their behaviors, identifying their patterns, understanding what they feared and what they believed themselves immune to. He had worked with the most brilliant cryptechs, the scientist-philosophers of the Necron noble caste, to develop something that did not yet exist, a technology capable of imprisoning a god. What they created was the Tesseract Labyrinth. The Tesseract Labyrinth operates on principles that defy conventional physics, creating a pocket-dimensional space within which even the near-infinite power of a Citan can be contained. To destroy a Citan outright was beyond even the Necrons' capabilities. The Star God's power exceeded what any physical weapon could annihilate, but to shatter them, to break their unity of consciousness into dozens or hundreds of fragments, each one a splinter of the original's power, and then to imprison those fragments within Tesseract labyrinths, that was achievable. Barely. At enormous cost. But achievable. The hypercannons that Sarek's cryptechs had built to accomplish this task were presented to the Citan as tribute. The Star Gods were told these devices were offerings, monuments to the Citan's glory, the finest technology the Necrons could produce as a gesture of gratitude for the victory they had won together. The Citan, secure in their certainty that the soulless metal beings who served them posed no genuine threat to entities of their magnitude, accepted this without suspicion. The revolt was swift. It could not have been anything else. Against the Citan, surprise was the only meaningful advantage the Necrons possessed, and that advantage would evaporate the moment a Citan understood what was happening and had time to respond. Sarek had spent a very long time understanding exactly how short that window of opportunity would be, and he had coordinated the revolt with a precision that made every other military operation in the history of the Necron Tyre and the Necrons look modest in comparison. Across multiple fronts simultaneously, the hypercannons fired on the Citan. The Star Gods shattered, their unified consciousnesses fracturing into the shards that the 41st millennium would come to know as Citan shards, each one a fragment of the original's power, contained and imprisoned before it could reconstitute itself into something capable of meaningful resistance. One by one, the remaining Citan were broken and shunned. The Nightbringer, whose sheer destructive capacity had once seemed beyond any possible check, was brought down. The Deceiver, for all its centuries of manipulation and scheming, found that Sarek's patience had exceeded its own. Even the Void Dragon, the most powerful of them all, was eventually shattered and imprisoned. There is one notable exception. One Citan was not simply shattered and imprisoned but destroyed entirely. The entity known as Londu-Gor the Flayer, a Citan whose portfolio in the ancient star god mythology was something connected to the stripping of flesh and the consumption of what once covered living things, was annihilated rather than merely contained. The Necrons did not want pieces of this particular entity kept anywhere. They wanted it gone. They succeeded, or at least that is what they believed. But Londu-Gor's destruction was not as clean or as final as it appeared. In its dying, it cursed them, and that curse would fester in Necron civilization for 60 million years, emerging eventually as one of the most disturbing phenomena in the setting. We will return to that curse in time. When the revolt was complete and the Citan shards were sealed in their tesseract labyrinths, Zarek looked at what remained of the galaxy his people had helped destroy. The old ones were gone. The great psychic species they had created were still present, the Eldari beginning to consolidate their civilization into what would eventually be the mightiest empire the galaxy had seen since the old ones themselves. The galaxy's material fabric was scarred and shattered in ways that would not heal for millions of years, if ever. The warp, which had been calm before the war began, was now a roiling, churning dimension of barely contained psychic energy, seeded with entities that had no benevolent purpose and every malevolent instinct. And the Necrons themselves, the people Sarek had led and failed and transformed and promised a future to, were exhausted, drained in ways that mechanical bodies did not fully experience, but in ways that the remnants of their consciousness absolutely did. They had fought a war across the span of millions of years, and they had come out of it victorious, but fundamentally broken. Their souls consumed, their emotional lives reduced to echoes of what they had been before the Soul Forges, their numbers diminished by the terrible cost of the war and the revolt. They could not fight the Eldari. Not then, not in that state. The Eldari were rising fast, their psychic power honed through exactly the warp connection that the Old Ones had engineered into them, making them almost as formidable a foe as the Old Ones themselves in some respects. And the enslavers still plagued the galaxy, feeding on the very psychic life the young races were generating, a plague born of the war's own excess. Sarek made the only decision he believed might give his people a future. He ordered the construction of the Tomb Worlds. Part 7. The Great Sleep. Silence across 60 million years. The building of the Tomb Worlds is perhaps the greatest engineering project in the history of the galaxy. Every Necron Tyre world that still stood, every system where the Necron dynasties had maintained enough infrastructure to implement the plan, was transformed. The cities, the industrial complexes, the administrative structures of Necron civilization, all of it was converted or replaced by the great tomb complexes, vast underground networks of engineered chambers that could maintain the integrity of a Necron's necrodermis body and the stability of the consciousness it housed for geological timescales. Millions of stasis crypts were built and tested and refined. The automated canoptech systems, the mechanical guardians and maintenance constructs that would watch over the sleeping armies while their masters dreamed in metal silence, were deployed in their hundreds of millions. The worlds were then purged. Every living thing was removed from the surface of a tomb world before the sleep began, because the enslavers still threatened, and enslavers required psychic beings to infect and use as portals. Without life, there was no foothold for them. The tomb worlds became dead planets, bare rock and whatever artificial landscapes the Necrons had constructed, with nothing living on their surfaces for the enslavers to exploit. It was a precaution born of bitter experience, and it was devastatingly effective. Sarek encoded his final command into the deepest layers of the sleeping Necrons' command matrices. They were to sleep for 60 million years. 60 million years, at the end of which the galaxy would presumably have changed enough that the enslavers would have passed. The Eldari's time of dominance would have come and gone, as all flesh's time eventually goes, and the Necron dynasties could wake and begin the long work of reclaiming what had been theirs. It was, by any standard, an extraordinary act of faith in a plan that no being had ever attempted on anything approaching this scale. 60 million years is not a number that maps onto any conventional understanding of time. It is longer than the history of most species. It is longer than the history of the land on Earth. Trusting that the tomb worlds would remain intact, that the stasis crypts would function without catastrophic failure, that the automated systems would maintain everything in perfect order across that span, was an act of either supreme confidence in Necron engineering or something approaching madness. Zarek himself did not sleep. This decision is one of the most quietly devastating details of the Silent King's story. He had ordered his people to lay themselves down and trust the darkness, but he could not do the same, not simply because he had practical reasons, though he had those too, but because he understood that the doom he had led his people into demanded something of him that sleep could not provide. He needed to know what he had done, to carry the full weight of it, awake, in the silence of the void between the galaxies, for as long as he existed. This was not self-pity. It was something closer to penance. Before he left, he did something that would have consequences 60 million years later. He destroyed the command protocols that gave him direct control over the Necron race. The ability to override the command matrices of every Necron in existence, to direct them all as a single unified force with his will as the engine, had been built into his body during biotransference as the supreme guarantee of Necron unity. He destroyed it, severed himself from the ability to command absolutely, left the Necron dynasties to govern themselves by the hierarchies and loyalties their noble castes had maintained before the sleep, and departed into the void. He traveled in a massive, planet-sized sepulchral engine, a vessel of extraordinary scale and ancient power, accompanied by legions of his own Zarakhan dynasty in stasis crypts within the vessel itself. Even in his exile, even in his penance, it was not appropriate for the Silent King to travel entirely alone. But the legions slept, and Zarek remained awake, perhaps the only Necron in existence who never entered the Great Sleep, traveling the intergalactic void in a silence that lasted longer than most civilizations have existed. Back in the galaxy, the tomb worlds settled into their deathless quiet. The enslavers gradually diminished as the living species they required grew isolated and fractured, their populations reduced, their psychic output insufficient to sustain the plague at the levels it had reached during the war. The Aeldari rose, building their empire, filling the psychic space the old ones had vacated with their own extraordinary culture and power. Millennia passed. Millions of years passed. The warp grew stranger and darker as the Chaos Gods slowly coalesced from the accumulated emotional weight of living civilizations, entities that would eventually become the defining horror of the galaxy's psychic life. The tomb worlds endured, most of them. Many did not. Zarek's hope that 60 million years of Necron engineering would preserve his people intact was not entirely realized. The scale of the undertaking had always made some level of failure inevitable, and failure compounded over geological time becomes catastrophic. Tectonic instability destroyed some tomb worlds entirely, the geological activity of living planets crushing the underground complexes that housed sleeping armies. Stars went supernova, consuming their orbital tomb-bearing worlds in stellar death events that gave no warning. Cascade failures in stasis crypt systems destroyed millions of dormant Necrons who never woke again, their bodies preserved, but their consciousness irretrievably lost to entropy. Other tomb worlds survived, but their inhabitants were damaged in ways that left them diminished. Necrons who had spent 60 million years in imperfect stasis woke with their memory engrams degraded, their personalities fragmented, their capacity for the complex thought that the noble castes were supposed to retain reduced to something erratic and unreliable. Some of these damaged Necrons devolved into aggressive, barely sapient things that would attack anything that came near their tomb. Others woke with their command protocols scrambled, their sense of identity dissolved, their behavior divorced from any coherent agenda. The Great Sleep was not the clean, perfect preservation Zarek had planned. It was a geological gamble on an impossible scale, and the dice had been weighted against it from the start. There is something that is worth pausing on in the nature of what went wrong during the Great Sleep, because the varieties of failure are not all the same, and they produce very different kinds of tragedy. A tomb world whose stasis crypts failed catastrophically and simply destroyed the Necrons inside is in a terrible way the kindest outcome. The beings in those crypts simply ceased to exist. There was no prolonged suffering, no awareness of what was happening, no consciousness surviving to experience the failure of the systems meant to preserve it. It was an ending, which after 60 million years of waiting might be considered a mercy. Far worse were the partial failures. The tomb worlds where the stasis systems functioned but imperfectly, where the consciousness matrices of their inhabitants were maintained but degraded, where memory engrams were corrupted gradually over millions of years until the being that woke was only a shadow of the one that went to sleep. These Necrons did not know what had been lost. They could not measure the gap between what they once were and what they had become, because the very cognitive infrastructure that would have allowed them to make that comparison was the thing that had been damaged. They woke into a smaller version of themselves, unable to miss the dimensions of experience and personality and memory that had been quietly erased, and this made their condition in some respects worse than if they had never woken at all. And then there were those who woke entirely, whose consciousness matrices were intact, but whose tomb worlds had been so extensively colonized or physically altered during their slumber that the world they woke in bore no resemblance to the one they had gone to sleep in. These Necrons experienced something that the Necron's mechanical nature makes especially strange, a kind of temporal vertigo, waking from what felt to their consciousness like a single absent moment, to find that everything they knew was 60 million years gone, their commanders long dead or equally distant in the same sleep, their allies potentially reduced to memory or simply nowhere to be found, the political structures they had been part of dissolved or transformed beyond recognition. The enemies they remembered, the old ones, simply not there anymore, replaced by species that had not existed when they closed their optical sensors and didn't exist in any meaningful sense to the protocols their weapon systems had been designed to engage. But the majority survived. The stasis crypts did their work across the unimaginable span of 60 million years, and the Necrons lay dreaming their mechanical dreams while the galaxy changed around them beyond any recognition. The Aeldari rose and fell, and their empire's burning collapse gave birth to the chaos god Slaanesh in an event that tore a wound in the fabric of space and time. The orcs spread across the galaxy, crude and bellowing and persistent. The strange adaptive species called humanity evolved on an unremarkable world, developed civilization, spread to the stars, collapsed, and spread again, eventually coalescing under the enigmatic figure of the Emperor into the Imperium of Man that now sprawls across millions of worlds. None of these species had any meaningful awareness of what lay beneath their feet on thousands of worlds across the galaxy. Humanity built cities on tomb worlds and called them unremarkable barren planets. The Aeldari knew, or suspected, but the knowledge was ancient myth rather than operational intelligence. Only the very few, very occasional scholars and explorers who found the buried ruins and tried to make sense of the empty chambers and silent machines suspected that something had been here, something vast and old, and had simply gone somewhere else. Then, in the late 41st millennium, the alarms began to ring. And across thousands of dead-looking worlds, metal fingers began to move in the dark. Part 8. The Great Awakening. An ancient evil stirs. The awakening of the Necrons did not happen the way Zarek had planned. It was never going to. The variables in a plan that needed to run for 60 million years without interruption or revision were always going to diverge from the original design in ways that no amount of pre-sleep calculation could fully account for. The Great Awakening was not a single moment, not a coordinated alarm across all tomb worlds simultaneously that brought a unified civilization back into being in a single dramatic hour. It was scattered, gradual, irregular, fitful, and in some cases profoundly wrong. Some tomb worlds woke early. Errors in the chronostat systems, the mechanisms responsible for counting the passing of time across millions of years and triggering the awakening protocols at the appropriate moment, caused some complexes to begin revivification thousands of years before the intended time. These early woken Necrons found themselves alone in a galaxy they had no context for, their kin still sleeping, the organized hierarchies they had expected to wake into absent, their crown worlds unresponsive. The early awakenings were chaotic, individual dynasties finding their feet in isolation, establishing territorial claims without the broader coordination that Zarek had intended. To manage this problem, these early woken Necrons eventually organized themselves into what became known as the Awakened Council, a temporary coalition to maintain some semblance of order and communication between the dynasties that had come back online before the majority. It was not a perfect solution, and it generated its own political complications, but it was better than 60 million years of careful planning being undone by solitary Necron overlords waking up in the middle of someone else's civilization without a strategy. Other tomb worlds woke in the correct time window, but found their worlds dramatically altered. Tectonic activity had reshaped the surface above their complexes. The worlds they expected to step onto were now inhabited, sometimes densely, by species that had built cities and civilization without the slightest awareness of what they were sitting on top of. The first contact between newly awakened Necrons and these inhabitants was rarely diplomatic. It was, more often, something considerably less pleasant for the inhabitants. The Imperium of Man encountered the Necrons in a way that the Imperium did not initially comprehend. The earliest Imperial records of Necron activity describe something like an infestation problem, a world's population reporting strange disturbances beneath the ground, then mechanical figures emerging from the Earth, then silence from the planet's communication systems, then nothing. The Imperium sent forces. The Imperium lost forces. The accounts that filtered back were confused and frightening, descriptions of enemies who did not die reliably, who could reassemble themselves from damage that would have killed any organic creature, who deployed weapons that stripped matter from the molecular level up and left nothing recognizable behind. The defenders of worlds that found themselves being reclaimed by their original owners were not fighting soldiers in any conventional sense. They were fighting history, 60 million years of it, arriving in the form of walking metal death with Gauss flares that could peel the atoms off a Space Marine's armor with the same casual ease that a flame peels paint. The Gauss weapons deserve their own consideration because they represent one of the most technically alien forms of armament in the setting. A Gauss flare does not fire a projectile in any conventional sense. It generates a field of directed electromagnetic energy that interacts with the atomic structure of whatever it is aimed at, breaking the bonds between atoms and energizing the constituent particles with an opposing charge that causes them to fly apart from each other. The target is essentially unraveled from the molecular level outward. This is not explosive damage or kinetic impact or thermal burning. It is systematic atomic disassembly, applied at range, at volume, against targets that include both organics and metals. The Imperium's tech priests studied captured Necron weaponry for decades and could not determine the underlying physical principles involved, which should give some indication of the gap between what human technology can do and what the Necrons have been doing for 60 million years. The Tomb Worlds were not only dead worlds reclaiming themselves, they were an emerging civilization reclaiming a galaxy. The dynasties that woke with the most intact stasis systems and the best preserved command structures had enormous advantages over those who woke damaged or partial. The Sautek dynasty, led by the legendary Pharaon Imhotep the Stormlord, emerged from the Great Sleep with its hierarchy almost completely intact, its armies functional, its crown world of Mandragora awakening in good order, with enough organizational coherence to begin immediate strategic planning. In the 41st millennium, the Sautek dynasty would rapidly become the largest and most aggressively expansionist Necron power in the galaxy, claiming more than 80 tomb worlds under its direct authority. What greeted the awakening dynasties was a galaxy unrecognizable from the one they had left behind. The Aeldari Empire had risen and fallen, and splintered into craft worlds, dark cities in the webway, and scattered exodites. The old ones' carefully tended garden worlds were mostly overrun with the species they had helped cultivate, who had developed in the millions of years of the Great Sleep into something none of them had been engineered to become. Humanity in particular had exploded in number and spread in ways that seemed to mock the very concept of containment. There are billions upon billions colonizing worlds in every corner of the galaxy, many of them built directly over Necron tomb complexes that were just beginning to wake. And the warp was no longer the calm dimension the Necron tier had known. It was a screaming nightmare, home to entities of monstrous power and malevolent purpose, the Chaos Gods fully formed and actively reaching into the material universe through every weakness they could find. The Eye of Terror, a massive wound in reality where the warp and the material universe overlapped, existed where once had been the heart of the Eldari Empire. The galaxy was not simply changed. It was transformed into something the Necrons had not been designed to navigate. But they were not ultimately designed to navigate it. They were designed to rule it. And that distinction shapes everything about how the Awakening dynasties approached the situation they found themselves in. The Great Rift, the galaxy-spanning wound in reality that tore open at the end of the 41st millennium and divided the Imperium in half, complicated the Necron position enormously. The rift was not simply a strategic obstacle. It was a massive intensification of everything the Necrons had always considered their greatest enemy, the psychic chaos that the war in heaven had ultimately been fought over, and that biotransference had been designed, in part, to protect them from. The warp energies the rift poured into the material universe were antithetical to the Necrons, in ways that went beyond the tactical, threatening the stability of the very tomb complexes that housed their still sleeping brethren, and the command structures that held their awakened forces together. The Necrons cannot touch the warp. They have no souls, no psychic connection to the immaterium, no way to channel warp energy as the Eldari or human psychers can. This is simultaneously their greatest protection and one of their most fundamental limitations. Their metal forms are immune to the corruption that psychers risk every time they reach into the warp, but they cannot benefit from it either. Warp travel, which allows other factions to cross the galaxy at speed, is not available to them in the direct sense. They use dolmen gates, imperfect portals through the webway that give them access to the Old One's transit network without requiring them to enter the warp directly. But these portals are unstable and have angered the Eldari, who consider the webway their inheritance. The Pariah Nexus represents Sarek's attempt to address the warp problem at scale. An enormous technological project designed to generate a field of anti-empiric energy that suppresses and blocks the warp across a wide region of space. The Pariah Nexus is an audacious piece of engineering, a direct attempt to recreate, artificially, the psychic silence that characterized the Necron Tire's relationship with the universe before biotransference made them being so divorced from the warp that even that silence had become something less than comfort. Part 9. Kings, Collectors, and Oracles. The Necrons' living history. It is one of the most important and often overlooked aspects of the Necron story that they are not simply an army of walking automata with no internal culture or politics. The higher nobility of the Necrons, those pharaons and overlords whose bio-transferred forms were built with sufficient complexity to preserve genuine personality and memory, are full characters in the complete sense, with agendas and rivalries and obsessions and long, complicated histories with each other that stretch back millions of years. Imhotep the Stormlord is perhaps the clearest example of what a fully awakened Necron noble looks like at the height of their power. Pharaon of the Sautek dynasty, commander of more than 80 tomb worlds, he is by any reasonable military metric the most competent active battlefield commander in the galaxy, not simply among the Necrons, but among any faction. His campaigns are architectural in their precision. He plans at the level of entire stellar sectors, building strategies that incorporate feints and deceptions and counter-strategies against enemy responses he has not yet seen, but has already calculated with algorithmic certainty. Even before the Great Sleep, Imhotep was a general of such renown that he had annihilated the entire Kuvu dynasty for reasons history has not preserved, and the phrase "gone like the Kuvu" became a common idiom among the Necrons, meaning utterly and irreversibly destroyed. Imhotep's signature battlefield tactic is a demonstration of how personal military style survives even through biotransference and 60 million years of stasis. He calls storms. The Sautek's technology allows him to generate dark energy storms of electromagnetic fury that engulf battlefields, disorienting and terrifying organic opponents in ways that go beyond the purely physical into the psychological. Imhotep understands psychology in a way that most Necron nobles do not, grasping that the terror of lesser races is itself a weapon. He has never, in recorded history, been defeated in direct battle. He has suffered setbacks, complications, tactical reversals, but never true defeat. He also never kills his defeated enemies. This is a quirk that strikes most of his opponents as bizarre and that has occasionally backfired on him strategically. but which reveals something important about Imhotep's internal life. He humiliates. He defeats a foe, severs a hand or captures them, and releases them back to their people as a living testament to his superiority. He wants them to carry the knowledge of what he did to them. He wants them to remember, to know in every moment afterward that Imhotep the Stormlord beat them and found them unworthy of a killing blow. It is a profoundly personal cruelty, one that requires a working ego to appreciate and a still functional pride to inflict. Imhotep is not simply a weapon system. He is a personality with a philosophy and the power to impose it on the galaxy. His relationship with Sarek, the Silent King who has returned from self-imposed exile to reclaim authority over all the Necron dynasties, is one of the most politically fascinating dynamics in the 41st millennium lore. Imhotep resents the Silent King's return, not merely out of ambition, though ambition is certainly present, but out of genuine ideological disagreement. Sarek's central hope is to eventually reverse biotransference, to find some way to return the Necron race to organic bodies, to reclaim the souls they lost in the Soul Forges. Imhotep considers this madness. He does not believe the metal forms they now inhabit are a curse. He believes they are an upgrade. The flesh was weakness and disease and death. What they are now is superiority, perfection of a sort that organic life can never achieve. Why would anyone choose to go back? Imhotep has actively sabotaged the Silent King's plans when they have conflicted with this position, destroying components of the Pariah Nexus and openly defying his authority during the war in the Pariah Nexus. Trazyn the Infinite is perhaps the most beloved Necron character in the broader fan community, and for good reason. He is the Necron's great eccentric, a being of extraordinary age and capability who has dedicated his existence to the one pursuit that might seem utterly incongruous with the mechanical coldness that defines his race. He collects things. Trazyn is the overlord of Solemnasi, a planet that houses what is either the galaxy's greatest museum or its most disturbing prison, depending on your perspective. And that distinction depends almost entirely on whether what Trazyn has collected is an artifact or a living being. His collection contains both. His exhibits of historical significance include genuine archaeological treasures from across the galaxy's history, items of cultural and scientific value that he has preserved when the civilizations that created them would otherwise have allowed them to be lost. His collection also contains living beings, specimens of species and individuals of historical significance, frozen in stasis fields in dramatic poses, displayed in elaborate dioramas that recreate moments of historical importance. Among his more notable collections are suspected space marine primarchs, which would make him the only being in the 41st millennium to have acquired these demigod-like figures as museum pieces. Whether the rumors are true is a matter of considerable debate, but the fact that the rumors exist at all, and that nobody who has visited Solemnas can definitively rule them out, says everything about what Trazyn is capable of, and what the limits of his acquisitive impulses might be. They appear to be none. Before biotransference, Trazyn was a Necron scribe and chief archivist, the individual responsible for overseeing the mummification of Necron pharaons. He was, in his organic life, the person whose job it was to preserve the dead, and his metal existence has not changed the fundamental orientation of his purpose as much as it has expanded its scope and ambition. He is genuinely one of the few Necrons who actively intervenes in galactic events for reasons other than military conquest, helping defend Cadia against Abaddon's 13th Black Crusade, when the threat to the planet's Necron pylons threatened to destabilize a region of space that contained items in his collection. His motivations were not altruistic in any conventional sense, but the practical effect was collaboration with the Imperium of Man against Chaos, which is not nothing. His rivalry with Oricon the Diviner is one of the great long-running feuds of Necron culture, stretching across 10,000 years of intermittent conflict that has endangered planets, altered timelines, and been documented in exhaustive detail in Robert Rath's novel The Infinite and the Divine, which is among the finest pieces of Warhammer 40,000 fiction ever written if you want to understand these characters at depth. Oricon is a cryptech, a member of the Necron scientific and technological elite, and his specific discipline is something that the Necrons call astromancy, the reading of stellar patterns to predict and calculate future events. Oricon has been doing this for millions of years. He has had millions of years to refine a craft that is already extraordinarily complex, and the result is a being who claims, and with reasonable supporting evidence, to have predicted the fall of the Aeldari, the rise of the Imperium, the Horus Heresy, and the coming of the Tyranids, all thousands of years before any of these events occurred. His predictions are not infallible, and the one thing he genuinely cannot predict is anything involving the warp, whose turbulent nature defies the mathematical analysis he applies to the material universe's stellar mechanics. But outside that limitation, Oricon's calculations have a track record that inspires either deep trust or profound fear, depending on which side of his schemes you happen to be standing on. Oricon also has a deeper project, one that puts him at fundamental odds with both Trazyn and the Silent King. He does not want the Necrons to return to organic bodies. He wants them to evolve forward, into something beyond physical form entirely, beings of pure energy that have shed the limitation of material existence altogether. He sees the Titan as proof of concept, entities that began as energy and found a way to exist without the constraints of matter, and he believes the Necrons could achieve something similar, but without the monstrous appetites that made the Titan terrible. This is a vision of the Necron future that is genuinely unique in the setting, a path forward that none of the other major figures are pursuing, and Oricon's 10,000-year rivalry with Trazyn has been as much about this philosophical conflict as about the specific objects and artifacts they have fought over. Onrakir the Traveler is another figure who deserves mention in any serious discussion of the Necrons' 41st millennium politics. Where Imhotep is interested in conquest, and Trazyn is interested in collection, and Orican is interested in transformation, Onrakir is interested in unity. He travels constantly between tomb worlds, seeking out those that have not yet fully awakened, assisting them through the process, bringing their forces online, and integrating them into the broader Necron consciousness that he is trying to rebuild from the scattered fragments of the Great Sleep. He is deeply critical of the Silent King's long absence, viewing Zarek's self-imposed exile as an abandonment of responsibility that Onrakir has spent his entire reawakened existence trying to compensate for. The Silent King's return has complicated Onrakir's position in ways that he is still navigating. Nemesor Zondrek is perhaps the most poignant of the major Necron characters. A former Necron-Tyre general of considerable renown, he woke from the Great Sleep with his memory engrams partially corrupted, leaving him with the belief that he is still fighting the wars of secession that divided the Necron-Tyr before the war in heaven. He commands his armies with genuine tactical brilliance, but his perception of who the enemy is and what the war is about is entirely disconnected from reality. His loyal bodyguard, Vargard Oberon, spends his existence translating between what Zondrek believes is happening and what is actually happening, intercepting enemies before they can reach a commander who might try to surrender to them in a gesture of interdynastic courtesy that the equally confused Zondrek would consider entirely appropriate. Zondrek's condition is extreme but representative of a broader pattern. Many Necrons who woke from the Great Sleep with damaged consciousness matrices suffer from forms of cognitive corruption that range from the merely eccentric to the entirely debilitating. The Great Sleep was never going to be kind to 60 million years of waiting, and its survivors reflect that reality in ways that make Necron civilization significantly more varied and strange than its mechanical exterior might suggest. Part 10. The Horror Within. Curses, madness, and the soul of metal. There is a dimension of Necron existence that the cold precision of their tactical reputation tends to obscure, and that is the profound, ongoing horror of what they actually are, and what living as they live actually costs. The Necrons are not simply an alien empire with a robot aesthetic. They are a civilization of beings who were once alive and remember it, who carry the cognitive imprint of what it felt like to exist in flesh and to have something more than instructions driving their behavior, but who now inhabit forms from which the crucial components of that experience have been permanently removed. The most visible expressions of this underlying horror are the two great curses of Necron civilization, the Destroyer cult and the Flayer virus. The Destroyer cult is what happens when the nihilistic potential inherent in Necron existence finds full expression. The Necrons were built to be weapons, to kill, to wage the wars of beings who no longer valued their own survival in the way that organic creatures do. For most Necrons, This drive toward destruction is channeled and directed by the command protocols and social hierarchies of dynastic life, aimed at enemies rather than everything. But for those who develop what is called the Destroyer Curse, that channeling fails. The drive toward destruction turns absolute and undiscriminating. Destroyers do not simply want to defeat their enemies. They want to eliminate all life, all of it, down to the microbial level. They will boil oceans to kill bacteria. They will spend decades continuing to purge a world after the last multicellular organism has died, driven by a compulsion to ensure that nothing at all, remains. There is a philosophical dimension to the Destroyer cult that is easy to miss if you look at it purely as a tactical dysfunction. The Destroyers have, in their own broken way, arrived at a logical endpoint of the Necron condition. The Necron Tyre built tombs because they feared death. They sought immortality because they could not bear the loss that mortality brought. They destroyed their own souls to escape the body that was killing them. And what they became was a weapon, a thing whose entire purpose was to kill. The Destroyers have simply accepted this completely. They have recognized that the Necron existence is one in which life itself is the enemy, the thing that keeps reminding them of what they lost, and they have committed to eliminating the reminder. It is not sanity, but it has a terrible internal consistency that makes it more disturbing, not less. Even other Necrons consider Destroyers disturbed and dangerous, confining them to uses as shock troops and keeping them at a distance from the rest of their society. The Destroyers themselves are aware, on some level, that they are broken. Many of them welcome the madness because it is the only thing that provides them with something like purpose in an existence that has been stripped of every other motivation. In the killing, they find the closest thing to meaning that their condition allows. It is a deeply dark kind of resolution. Scorpek Destroyers represent the most physically transformed of the Destroyer types, having gone so far down the path of the curse that their bodies have been extensively modified for close-range slaughter, their forms rebuilt around bladed weapons, and their movement optimized for closing with prey and destroying it personally. There is something in the Scorpek's behavior that goes beyond tactical utility into the purely visceral, a machine equivalent of frenzy that their fellow Necrons observe with something between respect and revulsion. They move in the kind of fluid, irregular patterns that suggest not the precision of a machine following instructions, but the unpredictable urgency of a being driven by something closer to compulsion. Their fellow Necrons deploy them carefully because a Scorpek Destroyer in full activation is something that kills what it is pointed at, but the pointing must be done precisely because its appetite for destruction is not naturally discriminating. The Flayer virus is, if anything, even more disturbing in its implications. We mentioned earlier that the Citan Landu Gore, the Flayer, was the one Citan the Necrons chose to destroy, rather than merely shatter and imprison. In its dying, it cursed them, and the curse manifests as a viral condition that spreads through the Necron population in ways that the great engineering of their necrodermis bodies was never designed to resist or eliminate. The Flayer virus creates a hunger, specifically, an obsessive consuming hunger for flesh, the one thing that the Necrons cannot actually have or use or benefit from in any material sense. Their metal bodies have no biological functions. They do not eat. They cannot. Their systems are powered by internal energy reactors, not by the consumption of organic material. Flesh does nothing for them physiologically, and yet the Flayer virus makes them want it with an intensity that overcomes everything else, that drives infected Necrons to hunt organic beings, kill them, and drape their flayed skin over their metal bodies as grotesque trophies of a desire that cannot be satisfied. The flayed ones who result from this infection are among the most frightening things in the Warhammer 40,000 setting, not because of raw power, though they are certainly dangerous, but because of what they represent. These are beings that remember being alive, that remember what it felt like to have skin, to be warm, to be organic in a way that connected them to the living universe. The Flayer virus does not give them their flesh back. It gives them the craving for it, a hunger for something they lost that cannot be returned and cannot be satisfied, expressed in the only way their metal forms have available to them. They are grief made into a curse made into a monster. There is something almost unbearably sad in what the flayed ones are when you understand their origin fully. The Flayer virus is the dying curse of a Citan, yes, but what it latched onto, what it amplified and weaponized against the Necrons, was something that was already there. The disconnection from flesh and warmth and biological existence that biotransference had created. The Flayer virus did not invent the Necron's sense of loss. It simply found the wound and infected it. The Flayed One's hunger for skin is the purest expression of something that exists in every Necron to some degree. The terrible, irresolvable mourning for the living selves they were before the Soul Forges consumed their souls and gave them metal bodies in exchange. Every time a Flayed One drapes fresh skin over its metal frame, it is trying to remember what it was. Every time that skin dries and becomes useless and they have to hunt again, they are forced to confront again the fact that no amount of collected flesh will ever give them what they lost. They are defined by their inability to satisfy an appetite that biotransference created, and they have been this way for 60 million years. Some have held the hunger at bay through sheer effort of will, managing the infection rather than surrendering to it. Others gave in long ago and now exist as something so far removed from the Necron Tyre who entered the Soul Forge that the original person is entirely unrecognizable in what remains. The Bone Kingdom of Drazak is perhaps the most extreme expression of the Flayer virus's reach. This entire Necron kingdom, every single one of its inhabitants save its ruler Valgul, the Fallen Lord, is composed of Flayed Ones. An entire civilization of beings whose defining characteristic is this particular form of torment. Valgul sends them out on what he calls times of bounty when the kingdom's supply of flesh grows thin, essentially managing the hunger of his subjects the way a farmer manages a herd. Because what else can he do? They are his people, and his people are trapped in a loop of longing that will never end. Against these horrors, the Canoptech systems that maintain and support Necron civilization take on a different significance. The Canoptech constructs, the wraiths and spiders and scarabs, and the more recently deployed reanimators that repair damaged Necrons in the field are not Necrons in the full sense. They do not contain the uploaded consciousness of former Necron Tyre individuals. They are autonomous mechanical systems, engineered servants whose loyalty and function are programmed rather than chosen, who maintain the tomb worlds through the entire 60 million years of the Great Sleep, and who continue to serve now that their masters are waking. The Canoptech Wraith is one of the most visually distinctive of these constructs, a serpentine phasing entity that can shift partially out of phase with normal reality, passing through solid matter as if it were not there. In the long millennia of the Great Sleep, they patrolled the corridors of empty tombs, maintaining the integrity of systems that could not be allowed to fail, moving through rock and metal with equal ease, keeping watch while their masters slept in silence. In battle, they serve a role that no other Necron unit quite fills: infiltrators and assassins that bypass conventional defensive lines by the simple expedient of treating solid obstacles as suggestions rather than barriers. The Canoptech spiders are the heavy maintenance units, large constructs that oversee the complex technical requirements of maintaining a tomb world and that can manufacture the scarab swarms on the battlefield, creating swarms of small mechanical insects that serve as everything from scouts to repair systems to weapons of attrition. The scarabs are perhaps the most flexible of all Necron units simply because of their volume and adaptability. They consume matter to fuel their replication, can swarm over vehicles and begin dismantling them at the molecular level, and can be respawned essentially indefinitely as long as there are spiders present to generate them. The reanimation protocols deserve particular attention because they represent the most visible expression of what makes the Necrons genuinely terrifying to fight. Every Necron body contains within its necrodermis a network of Canoptech repair systems that work automatically when damage is sustained, sealing breaches, rerouting power flows, repairing structural failures in the metal itself. The result is that Necrons who are downed in battle frequently reassemble themselves and stand up again, their body's own engineering correcting what destroyed them. A warrior put down by bolter fire may simply rise a few moments later, the holes in its chest already sealed, its systems already functioning, as if the shot that stopped it was a momentary inconvenience rather than a killing blow. This is deeply demoralizing to fight against. Every military doctrine that depends on a concept of finality, on the idea that once an enemy is down, they stay down, fails against Necrons in ways that require complete tactical reassessment. You do not kill Necrons. You disrupt them, overwhelm their repair systems, destroy enough of them fast enough that the protocols cannot keep pace with the damage, or reduce them to enough fragments that reassembly is no longer possible. It requires a different kind of fight, a sustained and overwhelming application of force, rather than the precise, targeted eliminations that work against organic opponents. The World Engine, the Celestial Orrery, the various Necron superweapons that appear throughout the lore represent the extreme upper end of what Necron technology can accomplish when it is directed toward a specific military or strategic objective. The World Engine was a continent-sized battle station, disguised as a planet, capable of destroying worlds and devastating space marine chapters before it was eventually brought down at enormous cost. The Celestial Orrery, kept in the heart of the world of Thanatos by the Oroskar dynasty, is a machine that controls the fate of every star in the galaxy. Its operators can cause any star to go supernova, destroying an entire system. They use it sparingly, aware that misuse could trigger a cascade of stellar destruction that the galaxy itself might not survive. There is also, woven through all of this technology, the question of what the Necrons' relationship to the Void Dragon means for the Imperium of Man specifically. The Void Dragon, the most powerful of the Citan, is believed by many in the lore to be imprisoned beneath the surface of Mars, in the depths of the Noctis Labyrinthus, placed there by the Emperor of Mankind in the ancient pre-imperial era when he still walked the world in person. The Adeptus Mechanicus, the tech priests who form the backbone of the Imperium's industrial and scientific capacity, worship a deity called the Machine God, or the Omnissiah, and there is a persistent, deeply troubling thread in the lore that suggests the entity they are worshipping as the divine source of all technology, the being they have built their entire faith and institutional identity around, is not a god in any benevolent sense. It is a shattered Satan imprisoned in a stasis tomb, leaking enough influence through its containment to shape the beliefs of billions who have no idea what they are actually venerating. The implications of the Void Dragon's potential awakening for the Imperium and for the galaxy as a whole are among the darkest possibilities the lore has ever gestured toward. Part 11. The Silent King's Return and the War to Come. The return of Sarek to the galaxy is one of the defining events of the 41st millennium's closing years, a development whose full implications are still unfolding in the lore of Warhammer 40,000. He had been in the void for millions of years during which the galaxy he had left behind transformed beyond recognition, and the Necrons he had put to sleep began their scattered, irregular awakening. He had been awake for every one of those years, processing time in the way that only an immortal being in a body of living metal can, with total clarity and no organic deterioration and no respite from the weight of memory. He remembered being Necron-tier. He remembered having a soul. He was, in all of Necron civilization, the only being who had been continuously conscious from the era before biotransference to the present day, carrying 60 million years of unbroken memory and the knowledge of exactly what he had done to his people. What finally broke his self-imposed exile was not reconciliation with his grief or the achievement of some personal inner peace. It was the Tyranids. In the intergalactic void, Zarek encountered the Tyranid hive fleets converging on the Milky Way. The Tyranids are extragalactic, creatures of pure biological purpose whose entire civilization, if you can call it that, is organized around the consumption of biomass on a galactic scale. They strip worlds down to their chemical components and incorporate that matter into their own biological systems. What they leave behind is dead rock, airless and silent, from which nothing will ever grow again. This was not, primarily, a threat to the Necrons themselves. The Tyranids eat living things, and the Necrons are not alive in any biological sense that the Tyranids' consumption mechanisms recognize. But it was an existential threat to the Necrons' future in a way that Sarek grasped immediately. His dream had always been that some path to reversing biotransference might exist, that the Necrons might eventually find a way back to organic existence, to reclaim the souls they had lost, and become something more than the soulless metal custodians they had become. But that dream required a galaxy with enough living biomass to offer vessels, to provide the organic raw material that any such reversal would need. A galaxy stripped clean by the Tyranids was a galaxy in which the Necrons' imprisonment in their metal forms became permanent not just in practice but in principle. There would be nothing left to return to. Zarek returned to the galaxy in the year 744 of the 41st millennium. He came carefully, not revealing his true identity initially even to other Necrons, working through Triarch Praetorians and unwitting cryptechs to assess the situation and begin organizing what needed to be organized before he could step openly onto the galactic stage. What he found was simultaneously encouraging and discouraging in roughly equal measure. The Necron dynasties that had woken were numerous and powerful. The Sautek dynasty under Imhotep had claimed an empire of its own. Dozens of other dynasties were awake and active. The Necrons as a civilization were genuinely re-emerging, finding their feet, reclaiming territory, and establishing the political structures of what could, given enough time, become something approaching the ancient empire's scope. But they were divided. The absence of Zarek and the destruction of the command protocols that had once allowed him to direct all Necrons as a unified force meant that the dynasties were operating independently, pursuing their own agendas, sometimes working at cross purposes, sometimes in open conflict with each other. The unity that the Triarch had always struggled to maintain among the Necron tier was no less elusive now that they were Necrons. When Zarek revealed himself openly, the galaxy's response varied dramatically. Many Necron dynasties acknowledged his authority and welcomed the return of the Silent King, the figure of supreme legitimacy in their hierarchy. Others, Imhotep's Sautek dynasty most prominently, saw his return as a complication, an obstacle between their current plans and their eventual objectives. Imhotep's rebellion against the Silent King's authority during the war in the Pariah Nexus represents the sharpest expression of this tension. The greatest military mind among the awakened Necrons, choosing open defiance over submission to a ruler whose central agenda he considered misguided. The Pariah Nexus itself is Zarek's most ambitious current project, a vast anti-psychic field generator that suppresses the warp across an enormous region of space. The implications of what this technology could achieve, if perfected and expanded, are staggering. A galaxy-scale Pariah Nexus would be a galaxy with no warp presence at all, no chaos, no psychic powers, no access to the immaterium in any form. This is, from Zarek's perspective, the necessary precondition for any long-term Necron dominance, and possibly for any reversal of biotransference. But it is also, from the perspective of every psychic species in the galaxy, including humanity, an existential threat. Because the removal of the warp would take with it the astronomicon that guides Imperial navigation, the psychic capabilities of Eldari, and essentially every advantage the younger races have developed that depends on their connection to the immaterium. The alliance between Zarek and the Blood Angels against a Tyranid incursion on the world of Gehenna stands as one of the most remarkable moments in recent 40,000 lore. Two ancient enemies fighting side by side against a shared threat, both parties aware that the alliance was temporary and that neither fully trusted the other, both parties ensuring that the other survived the engagement because the mathematics of the situation required it. It was pragmatism elevated to the level of policy, which is perhaps the most Necron approach to an alliance that has ever been recorded. Zarek has also encountered or communicated with the figure known as Sanguinius, or at least an echo of the Blood Angel Primarch, during his long sojourn in the Void, and claims that the great winged warrior of the Imperium was approaching a position that might have led to a formal alliance between the Necrons and humanity. The significance of this claim is difficult to assess, but Zarek does not appear to make strategic claims carelessly, and the idea that the Necrons and the Imperium of Man might find some accommodation, however temporary, in the face of the Tyranid threat and the chaos spreading through the Great Rift, is one of the most intriguing threads in the current state of the lore. Part 12, An Ancient Tomorrow, The Necrons in the Present and Future. The Necrons stand at a moment of extraordinary consequence in the history of the 41st and 42nd millennium. The Great Awakening is still underway. Billions of Necrons remain in their stasis crypts across thousands of tomb worlds, waiting for the revivification protocols that will bring them back online, some waiting for the Awakened Council or individual travelers like Anra Kir to find them and initiate the process. others simply following their chronostats toward awakening sequences that will trigger automatically when the correct moment arrives. The Necrons that are active now, the armies that the Imperium and the Eldari and the other factions of the 41st millennium have encountered, represent only a fraction of the total potential force that exists in the galaxy's underground. What the Imperium cannot fully know, and what keeps its most informed strategists awake in the quieter hours of the night, is that the Necrons they have fought so far are not the worst of what is coming. The Sautek dynasty, already considered overwhelming by imperial military standards, emerged from the Great Sleep nearly intact. Most dynasties did not. Most of what is still sleeping beneath the surface of 1,000 worlds is damaged, fragmented, operating at reduced capacity, its commanders working through the early phases of re-establishing the hierarchies and loyalties and internal communication systems that 60 million years of dormancy disrupted. When these dynasties finish the process of consolidation, when the full weight of Necron civilization achieves something approaching functional coordination, the forces the Imperium has fought will look like a scouting party. What the Necrons ultimately want is a matter of considerable internal debate. Not all of them want the same thing, and this is actually one of the most consistently fascinating aspects of the faction. The Silent King wants to reverse biotransference and reclaim organic existence for his people. Imhotep, the Stormlord, wants to complete the conquest that the Great Sleep interrupted, establishing Necron dominance over a galaxy from which all other significant civilizations have been removed or subjugated. Trazyn the Infinite wants to preserve everything worth preserving, which in his taxonomy includes almost everything, and his preservation project has an implicit assumption that the Necrons will be around to maintain the collections indefinitely. Oricon wants evolution into something beyond the current mechanical condition entirely. These are not merely different tactical preferences. They are different visions of what the Necron race should be and what the galaxy should look like when the Necrons have finished shaping it. The political conflict between these positions is as much a part of the Necron story as any battlefield encounter, and it makes the faction considerably more interesting than a straightforward conquest machine. The question of whether the Necrons can or should reverse biotransference is perhaps the most philosophically rich argument in the faction's internal politics. Zarek's desire to find a way back to organic existence is not merely sentimental. He understands something that the Necrons who embrace their mechanical nature resist grasping, that the loss of the soul is a loss that cannot be compensated by any accumulation of power or territory or victory. The Necrons are not suffering in the way that organic beings suffer, with pain and emotional distress that can be identified and addressed. They are suffering in a way that is much harder to articulate and much harder to remedy. They are the absence of something that should be there. They are a song with no melody, a portrait with no face, a civilization that functions perfectly and means nothing. Or, at least that is how Zarek understands it, and his 60 million years of continuous consciousness give him a perspective on the Necron condition that no other being in the setting can claim. Imhotep's counter-argument is not without its own logic. He is not simply a denial of what was lost. He is a genuine philosophical position, that what the Necrons became is superior to what they were, that the flesh was always the enemy, was always killing them, was always the source of the limitations and vulnerabilities and fears that drove them into the Satan's embrace in the first place. That to long for flesh is to long for the disease that was killing them, that the metal bodies are not a prison but a perfection, and that the dream of returning to organic existence is a form of masochism dressed up as redemption. It is wrong in the sense that it denies the reality of the soul's loss, but it is coherent. And for Necrons who woke from the Great Sleep without clear memories of what it felt like to be anything other than what they are, it may feel more true than Zarek's anguish. The Necrons' relationship with each of the major factions of the 41st millennium is its own story. With the Eldari, there is an ancient enmity that predates every other conflict in the setting, rooted in the war in heaven itself. When the Eldari were the Old One's weapons against the Necron tier, and the Satan consumed their creators without remorse. The Eldari Farseers have been predicting and working to prevent full Necron awakening for thousands of years, viewing the return of the undying race as an existential threat to the remnants of their own civilization. This conflict is not simply military, it is cosmological. Two civilizations who represent fundamentally incompatible visions of what the galaxy's future should look like, fighting over the right to determine it. The Aeldari carry in their psychic arts and their webway the legacy of the Old Ones, the closest thing the galaxy still has to the civilization that the Necrons destroyed to win the war in heaven. And the Necrons carry in their metal bones the memory of being the ones who destroyed it. With humanity, the relationship is more complicated. The Necrons generally view humans as vermin, short-lived interlopers who have built their upstart civilization on top of the ruins of Necron territory. Most Necron overlords who awaken to find human populations on their tomb worlds deal with them the way you would deal with any infestation. They purge. But there are exceptions, and these exceptions are arguably more significant than the rule. The Silent King's willingness to fight alongside the Blood Angels, Trajan's intervention at Cadia, the possibility of a broader accommodation against the Tyranid threat. These moments suggest that the relationship between the Necrons and humanity is not simply predator and prey, but something more complicated and potentially more significant. There is also the uncomfortable question of what it means that the pariah gene exists in humanity. The Aeldari have long suggested that the Necrons deliberately engineered this gene into the early primate population of Terra millions of years ago, creating a latent biological weapon within humanity itself. Individuals born with no connection to the warp, whose presence disrupts and nullifies psychic activity in everything around them. If this is true, and the evidence, while circumstantial, is significant, then the relationship between the Necrons and humanity goes back much further than any living human suspects. The Necrons may have been shaping the raw material of the human genome for their own purposes since before Homo sapiens walked upright. Every Calexis assassin in the Emperor's arsenal, every blank and untouchable who has served the Imperium's intelligence services and its secret wars may owe their nature to Necron interference tens of millions of years in the making. The Tyranids remain the most pressing strategic concern for Sarek and those Necrons who accept his analysis of the situation. Every hive fleet that reaches the galaxy and strips a world of its biomass is a world whose organic potential is permanently lost. The Necrons need the galaxy to remain biologically rich if any of Zarek's longer-term plans are to remain viable. This creates the genuinely strange situation of the galaxy's ancient, soulless mechanical civilization actively working to protect the biological diversity it simultaneously intends to subjugate or exploit. Sarek has never claimed to be doing this for altruistic reasons. He is absolutely clear that his goal is to serve the Necrons' interests. But the mathematics of those interests currently align with preventing the Tyranids from consuming the galaxy's biomass, which means that for the first time in 60 million years, the Necrons have a reason to preserve the civilizations they would otherwise be planning to remove. The opening of the Great Rift, the galaxy-dividing wound in reality that now separates the Imperium into two halves and pours warp energy into the material universe in quantities that exceed anything in living memory, is both a crisis and, from certain Necron perspectives, an opportunity. The crisis is obvious. The warp energy the Rift generates threatens the stability of tomb worlds near the Rift's influence, disrupts the dolmen gates the Necrons use for rapid transit, and empowers the Chaos factions in ways that make them more dangerous opponents. The opportunity is that the Rift has also destabilized every other faction in the galaxy, creating the kind of widespread confusion and crisis that, if exploited with sufficient strategic intelligence, could be used to advance Necron territorial claims, while everyone else is busy simply surviving. Sarek himself has a claim to knowledge that no other being in the setting can match. He has been conscious for more than 60 million years. He has observed the galaxy through the entirety of its recent history, from before the Old Ones fell to the present crisis. He knew the Aeldari when they were still a weapon being built for a war. He knew humanity before it had stars to look at. He understood the nature of the Satan long before any other being had the framework to conceptualize them. Whatever plan he is working toward, whatever ultimate endgame he is steering the Necron race toward through all the complexity of their political divisions and the galaxy's various catastrophes, it is a plan built on a foundation of knowledge and experience that cannot be replicated or fully understood by any being who has not lived what he has lived. There is one final thing worth saying about the Necrons that all the military analysis and political intrigue and cosmological stakes can sometimes obscure. The Necrons are a people who suffered an injustice so complete, so total in its violation of everything that makes existence worth having, that their entire civilization, since the war in heaven, has been organized around the consequences of that injustice. They did not choose to become what they are. The common soldiers, the warriors who stand in rows and advance and fire their Gauss flares and fall and rise again, never chose any of this. They entered the Soul Forge under orders, under the weight of command protocols that directed them as surely as the ones that now define their existence. And they came out the other side as something their former selves would not have recognized or wanted to be. They are, in a sense that the word does not quite capture, victims. This does not make them safe. It does not make them sympathetic in any way that should lead anyone in the 41st millennium to lower their weapons or open negotiations in good faith. The Necrons are genuinely, existentially dangerous to every living civilization in the galaxy, and their history of what they did to the old one's carefully cultivated galaxy is not a record that invites trust. But it does make them interesting in a way that simple evil never is, and it does suggest that their story is not finished in any sense that can be predicted. A race that has been seeking something it cannot find for 60 million years, that carries the memory of what it lost across that entire incomprehensible span, that has the power to reshape the galaxy and the tragedy at its core, to make that reshaping meaningful rather than merely violent, is a race whose story is still being written. The Necron race is not a simple story of ancient evil awakening to consume the galaxy. It is the story of a people who were failed by the universe, who failed themselves in their desperation, who paid the most terrible price possible for a wish that was never unreasonable, and who continue to carry that price in every action they take and every decision they make. They are the galaxy's oldest regret, walking in bodies of living metal, pursuing a future that none of them fully agree on, sustained by a sense of purpose that biotransference preserved even as it consumed everything else. The Necron Tyre are gone, but the Necrons remember them. In the encoded memories of their command matrices, in the residual personality engrams of their noble castes, in the obsessions of collectors and the calculations of oracles and the grief-driven hungers of the cursed, the Necron Tyr live on in fragments, scattered through the mechanical civilization they inadvertently created. They were a people born into suffering. They sought to escape it, and in the escape they found something that made the suffering look like mercy. But they endure. Across 60 million years of silence and now a growing, fitful, dangerous reawakening, they endure. The galaxy trembles at their return, and perhaps it should. But perhaps, in the full weight of their history, there is also something that deserves a more complicated response than simple fear. There is something that feels, if you look at it from the right angle and with the right amount of patience, almost like grief. If you made it this far, thank you, genuinely, for spending this time in one of the most extraordinary corners of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. The Necrons are a faction that rewards every hour you invest in understanding them, because every layer you pull back reveals something stranger, something sadder, something more philosophically rich than the one before it. They are not simply the enemy. They are a mirror, reflecting back at us questions about what we would sacrifice for the things we want most, and what we might become if we sacrifice too much. If you enjoyed this journey through their history, drop a comment and tell me which part of the Necron lore resonates with you most. Is it the tragedy of biotransference, the cold brilliance of Imhotep, the strange, mournful obsessiveness of Trazyn, the ancient patience of the Silent King? And if you are not subscribed yet, please do consider it. There is so much more of the Warhammer universe to explore together, and every subscription helps make it possible to keep going deeper. The galaxy is very old, and very dark, and very, very strange, and we have barely started.